Hey, George, you're a scientist.
I'm a chemist, yes.
Right, you're a scientist. So, I was thinking about the game Fallout because, before we did our science conversations, we played a lot of video games. We still play a lot of video games. We just talk about them slightly less than we used to. Um, but there was the Fallout TV show, which like brought a bunch of the monsters to life. And, the games have like realized all of these cosmic horrors. But like, what's the most unrealistic creature of all the insane Fallout monster mutations?
Well, darn it, Lions, I'm a chemist, not a evolutionary biologist or radiobiologist or something like that. But I'm not any of those. But with my very limited knowledge and very limited expertise, I will attempt to opine to this. So, couple disclaimers off the top. There's a lot of things in Fallout, and so I did my best to like pick the big uns, and kind of go through them. And so we'll kind of go through all of them, and I'll end with like this one I think is the most unrealistic. But I mean, there's so many things. And the other thing that I just completely discounted was anything that is like technomancy kind of, where it's like half human, half machine stuff. Because
like the brains inside robots, that kind of thing.
Yeah, stuff like that, where I was just kind of like, yeah, we're kind of focusing more on like the, radioactive Fallout craziness, not like, because I mean, there's a whole bunch of weird sciencey stuff that they do with like, for instance, the fat boy or whatever that, shoots a mini nuclear weapon and somehow doesn't kill you immediately, right? So there's some technology magic going on. So I was like, I'm just not going to deal with any of that. We can do that in another episode. So I went strictly biologicals, right? So those are the disclaimers off the top. So first thing, all of these are, I guess, honorable mentions because none of them won. First we can talk about the ghoul. So what is it? What strikes you as like weird about the ghoul?
So the problem with ghouls, I think, is one of the main problems with zombies is that they kind of seem to be functionally immortal, and they don't. I'm sure there's somewhere in the lore where they talk about this, but like, do they eat? Like, where do they derive energy? Right? Why do they not rot away to nothing?
Right.
This is like the general zombie problem of like, okay, I guess they eat brains, but like, what is keeping their body from just disintegrating into nothingness like rotting meat? Like they're
right.
At some point, their joints are apparently propelled by magic. So I guess could you survive all that radiation, and like, what would that do to your organs and your hair and skin and bones and whatnot? Like I am super not an expert there, but just how do they continue to function as living organisms is, I think, the first place my brain would go.
And that's legit, especially because there's, feral ghouls and ghouls, right? So some of them are still sentient. So the ones that are still sentient, that makes a little bit more sense, right? Because they would, eat and drink normally. I always kind of assumed with ghouls and with zombies in general is that, like, for whatever reason, their bodies are like, they are able to enter and exit a hibernative sleep very easily, right? So basically, whenever they're not running down prey, their bodies immediately start to hibernate,
So no hobbies. No, they don't. Nope. They don't clock out and do anything after hours. They're either chasing prey or like sitting there burning 0 calories.
Right, burning near 0 calories, right? So that's kind of how. So again, I was like, is it realistic? No, but it's less unrealistic than what the stuff we're going to be going through, right? The functional immortality though, because some of the ghouls are said to be like 200 years old, right? Like
yeah, there are people who were a bunch of the NPC ghouls they were alive before the war, right? So they're not like vault dwellers that became irradiated. They have survived out in the desert wasteland for the whole time.
Right. And so to me, that was the most unrealistic thing about them because, like, one they've got extreme regeneration, but you could hand wave that away with like, oh, well, their cells are able to divide incredibly rapidly, which, given, there are certain genes you can turn off within a cell that stops it from replicating all the time. And radioactivity would absolutely have the ionizing radiation to change that, right? So that means that somehow the ionizing radiation has made the cells less prone to copying errors, and that doesn't jive, like that'd be like me saying, that I am getting better photocopies of this picture after shooting a shotgun at it, like that the shotgun would make the image less reproducible, not more,
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because it's like, oh, their extreme regenerative ability is what keeps them alive, but shouldn't they just be like giant piles of cancer then, right? Like non-functioning mass of sadness.
Yes, exactly. So for whatever reason, the particular type of radiation that was done in this particular universe is way more statistically likely to keep the cell's degradative process intact, as opposed to just, randomly. Because in theory, every time you get hit with ionizing radiation, right, is that basically you're rolling the bones, and sometimes it'll create like cool, neat mutations, and but the problem is that it, again, to use the shotgun approach, right, is that like occasionally, if I were to take a shotgun to a car, I may hit it in just the right way to make it more aerodynamic and thus more fuel efficient. But it's way more likely I'm just going to damage the car beyond repair, right? So, so apparently this one, though, like when this radioactive scattering went out, all of them got the speed holes, and now they're all just more aerodynamic for whatever reason. So
yeah, those are ghoul holes. They make the human go faster.
Not super realistic, but again, like I'm like, all right, that's the level of realism, the amount of magic that we need to bridge the gap. Super mutants. What strikes you as weird about them?
I mean, it seems it would be far too convenient that something that all of the randomness that could have happened instead turned like a bunch of people into the Hulk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people have been exposed to radiation, but only the Hulk became the Hulk. And I think canonically that's because of like a quirk in his genes, right? Like someone else could not have become the Hulk if they had been in that same circumstance.
He was, when he got doused with gamma radiation, he was also juiced with super soldier serum. So like he was trying to be
I did not remember that.
Yeah. Is that he was trying to actually become the next Captain America, because all of the data and whatever was lost. So he like tried to recreate the process and instead made himself into the Hulk.
Whoops.
Yeah.
But there is definitely something suspicious about, okay. Cause I mean, they definitely eat, right? So once they become super mutant status, the idea that they could then survive is like, okay, well, they eat a lot of meat, right? They're just huge hulking humans, but it seems suspicious that a bunch of radiation would turn you into just a really like Arnold Schwarzenegger version of a human being, right? Like, no, they don't seem to have, they talk weird, but they don't seem to have like massive brain damage. Their organs all seem to work because they can maintain all that muscle mass, which must mean they're eating and like metabolizing calories and stuff. They have fine dexterity to like craft armor and work firearms and stuff. So like, other than they talk a little funny, it kind of seems like there's no downside to being a super mutant. And that just on the face of it is suspicious. Like, oh, this horrible thing happened. And wait, why do they kind of seem okay?
So actually funny side story. My wife Megan was trying to make a D&D character recently, and she was going to make a barbarian, and it was like a Path of the Beast barbarian. So they become like feral when they rage. And so she was like, yeah, I'm thinking kind of like a mixture of like the Hulk and Captain America. Like they were in the military, but then the military like experimented on them. And then like, so now they got like really like angry and like this kind of berserker rage. And I'm like, it's Wolverine. You've backed your way into that's Wolverine. Like, and she was like, oh, I guess it is. And I was like, yeah, you've recreated Wolverine. So
surely someone somewhere has done that math, right? Like this character plus this character equals that character.
Yeah. I got a huge kick out of it because like she literally like completely bespoke made this character. And I was like, you have piece by piece, like, and then you step back and look at the mosaic and you're like, that's Wolverine. Anyways,
I was really hoping part of that story would somehow inextricably include like, yeah, and they've got like these metal claws that they wear like as their weapon because they can use them when they're in their conscious mind and like their bestial rage.
Yeah, it's like you're messing with me, right? So I say all that to say, interestingly, so co-sign everything you said. But when I dug into the lore a little bit, super mutants were actually genetically engineered, like pre-war.
I did not know that.
Yeah, like they were working on genetically engineering these things, and then things went sideways, and like they got out and like started proliferating and all
So
that kind of stuff.
they're supposed to be Hulks.
Yes,
Like they were making their Hulks for war, and
yep.
Okay, so they have nothing. Like they're a whole society. Like they can reproduce. Like they mate
Apparently.
and make more super mutant children.
Yep.
Huh.
Yep. And so yeah. So so I was just kind of like, oh, okay, well that makes them. I mean, honestly, if you take away ethics, we could probably do that today. Like
Yay.
With CRISPR technology, like yeah, that'd probably be pretty straightforward to do. So bummer and yay, I guess, but not very unrealistic is the moral of our story, right?
Right.
So the next thing I went to were mammals, right? So you've got your Brahmin, your rats, your Yao Gai, like things like that. Honestly, those aren't very unrealistic at all, right? Like a Yao Gai is just an irradiated bear, right? It's just a bear that's angrier. One of the things, though, I thought that was interesting, specifically with the Brahmin, is that they have two heads, right? So having, again, a genetic mutation caused by radiation that would cause you to grow another head, again, not a cellular biologist or anything like that, but that is within the realm of realism in my mind, right? But the idea that that would be selected for evolutionarily to the point where they would be around is low, right? But the thing that I thought was interesting when I thought about it, it's like, but the factor that we're not including is, so there's a reason why we all don't have two heads, right? Is because like it's incredibly, genetically intensive, it's energy intensive to have one brain, much less two, all of that kind of stuff. And there's nothing selecting for it. But in this scenario, the entire time that the Brahmin have been around, they could have been artificially selected for by humans because we think it's interesting or neat,
right.
Or for whatever reason. So I was like, actually, when you suddenly add, because somebody once said to me, the greatest evolutionary trait for success in today's society is being useful to humans. Like if you're useful to humans, suddenly your population booms. And so I was like, yeah, so if for whatever reason humans decided I like cows with two heads, it'd be very doable, right?
Yeah, there could have been like totally viable bovine with a normal head, right? And we were just like, those two-headed ones are cool, and that's just what we did. Especially the bovine in particular, because we were already selecting for them, right? So it like we were already in the store shopping, and if we were just like, oh, the two-headed model is in, like it's like, well, we're already there to spend money.
Well, especially if for whatever reason, let's just say that it's like, hey man, because of all this radiation, these cows are now 50% more beef, It's like, oh, that's awesome. They also have two heads. Dude, whatever, man, but more beef, you say, like.
I almost wonder if it was, these cows are 50% more beef. They bought the cow, and then they were like, did I say 50% more beef? I meant it has two heads.
And then they
just didn't want to admit they'd made a poor purchasing choice, and they're like, okay, I guess we're doing this now.
I honestly was like, if it wasn't for the societal collapse, if we were going straight with end stage capitalism, I'd be like, yeah, no, they bred it with two heads because then they could say like, oh, it's 20% more weight per cow. And it's like, yeah, but it's a head. What are you going to do with it? And it's like, no, I just said 20% more weight per cow. That's all I said. But since society collapsed, I was like, that's probably less likely. So death claws.
Yeah, I was hoping we were going to get to death claws. I am not shocked that they're only an honorable mention, but that gives me some pause for what's coming.
Yeah, no, but death claws are just an honorable mention. Would you like to know why?
Well, I want to be clear on what a death claw is, because I don't know the lore of death claws. I only know the horror of like firsthand experiences with them.
Oh my God. Especially because they're so powerful. Like when you're level 3 and you're running around and you see like, hey, what's that? And then it starts running towards you at full tilt. You're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, a death claw is basically it's like a man-shaped velociraptor, right? Like it's got giant, Wolverine claw hands, but it's bipedal like a velociraptor. Yep. I think it has a tail, but it's kind of the upper body is sort of humanoid. Yeah, it's like a velociraptor centaur, right? Like humanoid upper body, like velociraptor lower body.
Yeah. It's kind of like the what are those things called? Chupacabra. It's kind of like a big chupacabra.
Yes, that is probably actually what it really is. but I don't know like their backstory. Like where in universe were Deathclaws supposed to have come from?
Also genetically engineered pre-war. So that's why I was like, you see,
God damn it,
like you
late
think
stage capitalism.
yeah, right. So I mean, like the problem with a lot of these is that it wasn't nature randomly doing some nonsense. It was humans deliberately doing some nonsense. I'm like, well, I mean, if you take ethics out of the equation, which it seems like they absolutely did, then like all of a sudden, a lot of this becomes very viable, right? So not death claws. So that brings us to, in my opinion, what the most unrealistic creature is in Fallout: the humble radroach.
Radroaches.
Yes, I'm going with radroaches.
Okay, so Radroach, if I recall the games correctly, literally just a gigantic cockroach, right?
It's a gigantic cockroach.
Yeah, they don't have 10 heads. They don't have guns grafted to their antenna. They're just, they are cockroaches, but they're the size of like a medium dog.
Yes. Yep. And I think that is the most unrealistic thing. And here's why. So let's take a step back and let's talk about what all cells need to live: oxygen, right? So oxygen can normally diffuse about 100 micrometers from like its source before all of a sudden it starts to like slow way down, right? And basically anything that's more than 100 micrometers away from a source of oxygen, if it's a cell, can't get to that oxygen, right?
Yeah.
So
this is why we got blood all over us.
Exactly, right? So when you say like how did we get around that, right? Like how come? Because that's why insects are so small, right? It's like, well, how did we get around that? It's like we didn't. We just created we allow a lot of the outside into our insides, and so that's what we did. So what that means is that 70 million years ago there were giant, radroach sized stuff, right? So you might want to say like, well, but they existed before. Why can't they now? It's because at the time the Earth was a lot hotter, which allowed them for a faster metabolism, which allowed them to get rid of some of the problems with the oxidative process. But also too, there was a lot more oxygen in the air, right? So the way diffusion works is that it's a high concentration thing moving towards a low concentration thing, right? So if you've got a higher concentration, it will push further, right? It'll diffuse further until it considers itself at an equilibrium, right? So that's not the case in the Fallout universe, right? The Fallout universe isn't 70 million years ago. It's in today's state, right? So that means that right now, insects are as big as they can be. And now all of a sudden, these insects have become 4, 10, 20 times bigger, right? So what they would need is to have developed a circulatory system. And that I consider to be horribly unrealistic, because with all these other things, even with like the weird regeneration, you're 1 or 2 degrees removed from its base form. You've just given it a little extra spice, right? For this thing, you've completely changed its insides. You would need to give it lungs. You'd need to give it a heart. You'd need to give it veins. And I just don't believe that. And this is not one that was genetically engineered from humans pre-war. This would have had to have been nature just making mistakes, right? And so I just don't believe that nature would have made all of those mistakes in that direction for the humble radroach. So, humble radroach.
Gross. I'm thinking about like killing one and it spilling out like a mammal, like right? Like because one of the first things you do in one of the games is it's like, oh, here's how the shooting controls work. Go shoot some radroaches that got into the vault, right? And it's like it would be like shooting a small dog because it would have like a lot of blood and lungs and organ.
Yep. Central nervous system. Yeah, it'd be a complete mess, right? And so I was just, as I was thinking about it, and one of the reasons why I thought this would be an interesting question is I was like, honestly, there's so much wild, weird stuff in Fallout, but it's pretty unreal. And to be fair, this is true of like all of the large insects, the botflies, all of that.
And any insect that is now giant.
Yeah, exactly. But I was just kind of like, no, you know what? Honestly, when I really sit down and think about it, I think that developing entire series of organs that you didn't have going into it is more unrealistic than like, oh, well, you just grew another head, and like genetically it's selected for that or what have you, like, or even super mutants genetically engineered from the beginning, or with ghouls, you're like, okay, well, somehow we have to say that their cells are dividing perfectly, right? But I can at least describe that, where I'm like, their cells are dividing perfectly. I don't know how they're doing it. That's the magic part, but that's what's happening. Whereas it's like somehow they evolved a circulatory system in under 200 years from scratch. I think like the first pass at that would have probably taken like 100 million years. I'm like, I don't know. I think that they'd be radioactive soup before that happened.
So let me ask from the reverse direction, could mammals survive in the kind of environment that made it possible for giant bugs? Like, could we breathe that air in that density and with an atmosphere in that levels of concentration? I don't think there's anything about nuclear war that would have completely changed the density of oxygen in the atmosphere. In fact, it seems like it would probably do the opposite and create like a greenhouse nightmare world. But let's pretend for a second that it made like hyper dense, oxygen dense air. Could mammals like coexist in that time?
Interesting. Off the top of my head, I believe so. Yes, I think that the lifespans would probably be a lot shorter, because like breathing in extra oxygen, like oxygen is one of those things that it's so reactive, right? That I just imagine that there are like silicon-based aliens out there that use like nitrogen-based processes or something like that, and they're like, oh my god, you use oxygen to fuel your processes? What is wrong with you? I mean, good God, if you did that, you'd probably only live 80 years tops, Yeah. So I imagine it would probably shorten your lifespan. But I think that, because I know that like you can breathe more oxygen rich, be in oxygen rich environments, and it won't immediately kill you, but it will start to cause problems. And I don't know how much more oxygen there was in the air to facilitate the bugs getting so much bigger, right? So maybe, but I do think that if all of a sudden because the heat was also part of it, is it because it allowed for faster metabolisms? And if anything, after nuclear war, you'd more likely have a nuclear winter than, heating the earth. So, I would probably stand by the fact that the air is not suddenly super saturated in oxygen,
And humble organ-filled rad roach. Gross. This does remind me of talking to you about anything else, though.